All right, let's go ahead and get started with this session, and thank you, Ian, for your conversation this morning. One of the things that Ian pointed out is that at the Smithsonian, we can look at digitization through many lenses, and that's really what this session is about. This session is about showcasing impact, and we have 5 different speakers who will be talking about different projects that they've worked on. My name is Mark Kornmann. I'm Associate Director at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. I also head the Education and Public Engagement departments at the museum. So our speakers today, Laura Coyle. Laura is the Head of Cataloging and Digitization at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Next speaker is Karen Lemmy. Karen is the Curator of Sculpture at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And then Stephanie Norby. Stephanie is the Director of the Smithsonian Center for Learning and Digital Access. And the question earlier about teachers, you're going to get to see how we involve teachers in digitization. And then finally, we have Matilda McQuaid, and Matilda is the Museum Curator for Textiles at the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. What we're going to do is each of the speakers will have about 8 minutes that they will go through their projects, and then we will bring everybody back up and we'll have a panel discussion, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So I will be the first up. So at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, we're actually getting ready to undergo a transformation revitalization. We're actually going to redo the entire museum, from the outside stone to the mechanicals to all 24 exhibitions within the museum. And so when we talk about digitization, this is a critical period for us because we are taking all the artifacts down and we're moving them out of the museum. So this is an opportunity for us to digitize our collection and then also look at how are we using that collection with our guests. So we have really been working on our digital engagement strategy. And so some things that we're looking at and questions that we're addressing. The first is, how will the guest experience change? So when we talk about digital and we talk about our digitization, in the past we've said, okay, let's do our exhibition. Okay, now here are the assets, here are the things that we have digitally. Now what are you going to do with them? And so one of the things that we've decided to take a step back and look at is, from the very beginning, what is the guest experience like? Whether it be those that are coming to the museum or those that never step foot in the museum. And 3 basic tenets that we came up with at the museum as we looked at this, and I should say our board of directors for the museum, they're very involved. We have a future state committee that actually has been meeting for the last 4 years and really looking at how do we design an experience at the museum for those internally and those externally. So our 3 basic tenets are outside in, experience first, and agile content. Outside in, typically at the museum, we've designed the exhibition, and then we take the digital assets outside the building. What we are doing now is looking at the outside and what's relevant, what's important to the guests. Ian made the comment about having our guests and people involved in the early start. And I should say one of the things that we looked at and we talked about in the evaluation process and having front-end evaluation is, sometimes we say that we're going to do that and we say, okay, well, what do they want? And so we go out and say, well, what do you want in regards to this artifact or this collection or this exhibition? And then you get from the audience, we're not sure, or some people will give you one-word answers to that. So what I would encourage you to think about, and that we've been thinking about, is in terms of front-end evaluation, we will take our assumptions from our curators and from our collection. We will gather those, put together some type of plan, and then that's when we do the front-end evaluation to figure out what the guest wants. The second is experience first. A lot of times we start with the artifact or the object first. And so one of the things that we've talked about is we start with the experience first. What is the experience that we want that guest to have when they come through the museum or they go to that collection that's online? And then we decide what things go around that, what artifacts are we going to use. And then finally, agile content. That has been an interesting thing at the museum. looking at how quickly do we respond to what's happening in the public. How quickly can we get an artifact on display when something's happening in the public? And so we've really been looking at what are our processes, what are the people that are in place, how do we do that? How do we take something that we've digitized? We work with the DPO office and we digitize some of our collection. And the question is, what do you do with it then? And when you do something with it, how do you iterate it? How do you test it and adjust quickly and be agile? Finally, two other things. How can we involve the public as collaborators? And this is probably for the museum one of those sticky points when Ian was talking about open access. Having folks collaborate around the collection and around what we digitize is an issue that we struggle with, and we're trying to figure out what's the right balance in using the public as collaborators. And then finally, how can audience insights shape the future of the museum? With 24 new exhibitions opening, and we will open fully in 2024. So the question is, in 2024, what is it that is going to engage the public? What is it that they want to know, and how do they want to take that information, and how do they want to use it? So the first thing that we look at is involving the guest, and one of the things that we did is we took, in the first 9 galleries that we're designing, we actually had interactives, and typically the process has been we have a team that works with the curators, that works with designers, they design the galleries, they design the interactives, it goes out on display, then we do evaluation. So what we decided to do this time is we developed prototypes around the interactives and what we were doing, and then we actually had 4 weeks in July that we had open interactive testing. And so folks could come and they could sign up for testing. They could go through the interactives, and it's been very interesting. We had 13 interactives that we tested, and probably 9 of those we kept. 4 we decided that they weren't what the audience wanted, and they weren't highlighting parts of the collection that folks wanted. So involving the guests, I think, is very important, and I think it's also important when you do that. The next thing, the guest experience, and this is something I talked about earlier. This is an example. We created a media wall in the museum in the opening gallery. This wall has wayfinding. You can go up in the orbs that you see there. You can find where there are objects in our collection. You can save these, and then you can download those to your app. So we looked at how do we want the guests to use this? And I say guests in terms of don't just think inside the museum, outside the museum as well. If they're going to go to our website or they're going to go to a portal, how do they want to use this? Where do they want to go with the information? How much information is the right information? Sometimes we think about the label that we have for that collection, and we think of it in terms of just that object, but we don't think of it in terms of the guest experience and what they want from it. So the next thing is storytelling. One of the things that we decided as we sort of redid our digital strategy is that storytelling would be at the heart of what we do. We're going to look at different aspects of that story. We're looking at the people behind the story. Typically, we've again had the artifacts and we highlight the artifact, but we don't go into deep storytelling. And so that's one of the things that we've looked at in this process. And then looking at beyond the walls, how are we going to take our collection once we've digitized it, once we've put the story together and put it in the context? How do we then share that beyond the walls of the museum? Our board of directors, one of the things they say is the museum, the Air and Space Museum, we get about 9 million folks annually at the 2 locations. So it's the world's most visited museum. But how do we get 80 million or 800 million people beyond the walls of the museum to use our collection, to use our stories? And so that's one of the things that we're looking at. And then public programs, again, in terms of the digital assets and what we're doing, the question is how do you take it and then put it into a public program setting? And so we've really been looking at ways of taking what we do at the museum and then putting it out on different platforms. And I think earlier the conversation about partnering is critical to what we're doing. A lot of this is not that we're creating new platforms or new ways of doing it. We're using existing platforms. And I think one of the things that we found, and our group, we talked about this, is that you develop these digital strategies and these digital products, and the question is, how do we market and promote that? And that seems to be one of our biggest issues, is we design them and then we push them out, but a lot of times we push them out by ourselves and we don't utilize those partnerships that have the mass distributions. So that's one of the things that we're looking at. And so 3 things that we designed in our new digital strategy. We have a new app called GoFlight. We have the media wall that we looked at, and then we redesigned the website so that all of those were integrated. They all feed off a central system. So once we digitize the collection, they're in the system, they have the content around them, then they're available to use on all 3 of these platforms. So here you see the GoFlight app. It launched in July of 2016. We've had about 71,000 downloads. We've had about 47% repeat opens. About 46% of the folks were offline or offsite when they opened the app. The story topics that we selected, we had about 765,000 stories that were selected. Email subscribers, about 2,900. One of the things that we did on our Wi-Fi, when you go into the building, it actually comes up and then asks for your email, and that's a way for us to keep involved with you and send you notices. Favorites that were saved, 177,000. The wall syncs to the app were about 8,166, and email conversion rate was about 3.6. So some of the visitor evaluation that we got, most visitors rated the wall either excellent to superior. But I would say one of the things that we found with the wall in the museum is that a lot of people will not go up and touch it. It has a lower row of interactives. And what we have found is that when kids come in, they see it, they go up, and they immediately know how to use it. And that's when the adults will then go up. If you have a group of adults, they will look at it, and the theory is, well, we're not supposed to touch anything. So we've been working really hard to figure out how do we get people to understand that this is a tool for them to use as they come into the museum. Observations, kids were engaged. Most visitors use the wall casually. And not really for wayfinding, which is one of the things that we were trying to do in the beginning. Marketing strategies require more testing and iteration, and then the app feature sets merits for finding in order to focus our core utilities. One of the things that I will say that we found with the app is we put too much stuff on it. Our visitors got overwhelmed in the app, so one of the things that we've done is we've actually looked at stripping that back. All right. I'm going to run through these quickly because I'm out of my time. So a couple next steps, we're going to look at an audience engagement plan. We're going to test and adjust more. And then we're going to engage planning and exhibition teams and looking at the visitor experience first. So let me introduce our next speaker. Laura Coyle will come up. She's from the African American History and Culture Museum. Laura?
Good morning. Good morning. Can you hear me? I would like to thank the Digitization Program Office for inviting me to speak, and the conference itself has been wonderful, very inspiring and informative. I also want to thank my digitization team, the Digi team at my museum, because without them, we wouldn't have a program. The theme here today is digitizing to change lives, and it's a really important topic. It's important because digitization is expensive. We really need to justify what we're doing and make a compelling case if we are going to digitize at the level that we're talking about in these talks. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about impact. That is the topic for here, but we've only been open a year, and we're still learning very much about what our impact, what it is, what it could be, and how we'll move forward. Our museum's digitization program supports our mission, and our mission is to give voice to the centrality of the African American experience and to make it possible for all people to understand the depth, complexity, and promise of the American experience. We also hope to serve as a national forum for conversations about difficult issues around race and social justice, and we collect materials that relate to the African American experience. Our plans are to make our collection as directly available as possible for research, exhibition, educational programs, and for personal use. And our goal is 100% digitization. We have many fewer objects than the natural history collections, but they probably take a lot longer to catalog. Our museum, our intention is to change lives, and we have evidence that it does. We have people who are making pilgrimages to our museums. When people come, they stay for hours. The average visit to the Smithsonian Museum is about 2 to 3 hours. People come to our museum and they stay 5 hours or more. Many of the people who visit are elderly. Some of them say they have to visit the museum before they pass. Many say they're coming home. Everyone I know has been moved or enlightened by their visit. Part of the museum's power is because of the building. It's on a nearly sacred space, the National Mall, but part of the power is also the programs and exhibitions, and after 100 years, the museum finally exists. We've had 2.5 million visitors. I've heard 3, but this is 2.5 is official. And we've had all kinds of people visiting, kinds of impact we know we're having in the galleries. I have 2 examples. The NBA Players Development Group is bringing groups of young ball players who have just joined the league to visit the museum to help them build empathy. These are athletes around whom the world has revolved for many years, but they're coming to our museum to find out about our nation's history and where they fit. We also had 50,000 school groups apply in the first month to bring students for a visit. This is extremely heartening. The reception's been huge and positive, and we're certain that the museum is having an impact. We're not exactly sure how. What about digitization? Before the museum opened, the museum's presence was largely digital and through the media. We provided thousands of images. And again, I want to thank the DPO and my museum for providing the resources to make beautiful images of our collection and to catalog it, to have a team of catalogers to get this information out. One of the reasons we had such great coverage is that we had such great images. I'm convinced of that. We had enormous coverage at the opening, following the opening, and it's still happening. The Smithsonian's really never seen anything like it. Inside the museum, digitization is essential. It helps us tell powerful stories. We have interactive experiences throughout the museum. We have many digital displays, and we have, I think, more than 130 media pieces. We also have a mobile tour. All of these things you can find out about by going to our website. On site, the museum and the digital experience cannot be separated. We live in a digital world. People expect to have media with them all the time. Together in the museum, we really seem to be living up to our promise, which is to present the depth, complexity, and promise of the American experience through an African American lens. See. Outside the museum, digitization has to stand on its own. We can't replicate the experience of visiting the museum, but we can use digitization in 4 effective ways. The first, visiting the museum is a privilege. Many people will never get to the museum for one reason or another, and if you've tried to get a pass for a friend, you know how that can be. Digitization takes down that barrier. Even for those who visit, we have fewer than 3,000 objects on view. Digitization greatly expands our reach. We have more than 10,000 objects online to the public now. That may not sound very much to the natural historians here, but for us, that's a really major achievement to have that much of the collection available. Third is that digitization is a gift that keeps on giving. A trip to the museum could be a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and it's impossible to see everything on a particular visit. You can keep going back to visit the museum virtually over and over. The fourth important thing is that basic digitization of the collections lays a digital foundation for multiple types of other kinds of digital engagement. We are just building the foundation now for what we want to do. I'd like to say a word now about access. This conference is talking about moving beyond access to impact. But for us, public access to our collection is powerful in and of itself. Our collection bears witness to contributions, trials, and triumphs of African Americans and about the African American experience. I'd like to argue that, like our museum, having our collection digitized and now to the public is having an impact simply because it exists. It documents a history of a people that have been consistently marginalized, and our collections, actual and digital, help to set the record straight. Therefore, it's really imperative for our records to be trustworthy and reliable. We also have a commitment to making all of this information as widely available as certain copyright laws will allow. We interpret museum use very broadly in my museum. Having all of this out is powerful. Get it out there. That was the motto of our first year. I want to look at a few examples of ways that we're reaching people digitally. We have an exhibition called Many Lenses. It's a collaborative project with two other museums, the American Indian Museum and American History, where curators talk about similar items from their collections, respective collections, from the perspective of their own museums. Quilts, lowrider cars have been a topic of two of those exhibitions, online exhibition interactions. We also have a feature called Collection Stories, and we did something radical. We allowed non-curators to write about our collection and share their ideas and perspectives online. We did it in partnership with the curators, but it allowed a look from, I would say, the curious as opposed to the learned point of view in some cases, to borrow something from Ian Owens. And it hit at some often very fundamental things about our collection that strike people who work within the museum and that they think they are compelled to share. We also have a Transcription Center project, not up here, but has engaged thousands of visitors. And I really encourage everyone to Google Smithsonian and transcription and check it out. It's an amazing resource. We're doing three-dimensional imaging for our collections. We hope to print some of those scans as well as using them in interactives in order to have physical replicas that people can use in the galleries. And we're experimenting with augmented reality and virtual reality. In conjunction with an exhibition about the Poor People's Campaign, we will be excuse me, I have my times up, so I want to find up. We're going to have a virtual reality where you can imagine what it looked like, see what it looked like during the Poor People's Campaign when it took place on the Mall. Just to wind up, I want to talk very briefly about a story that we put up on our collection site about Muslims in early America. The story includes video, photographs, history, and objects. And the day that it was posted, the curator in our collection put a link to her Facebook page and heard back immediately from a teacher that she knew who wrote back that she was going to use that story in her collection that very day. She had already scheduled a talk about a discussion about Muslims in America. We are hoping that these kinds of stories will have an impact. It had an impact on that teacher, we hope on the students, not only about the way they feel about Muslims in America, in early America, but perhaps how they feel about Muslims in America now. At this moment, this is critical, and this is why we digitize at our museum. Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce the next speaker, who is Karen Lemmy from the Smithsonian American Art Museum.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. My presentation is rooted in the 19th century, a 19th century sculpture, really the farthest thing from a born digital object. But the parallels between 3D scanning and 19th century methods of replicating sculpture are astonishing. It started out with a plan to build an exhibition about Hiram Power's Greek slave, the making, really, of the most famous sculpture of the 19th century. And I'm showing you here Hiram Power's Greek slave in the US presence at the Crystal Palace exhibition in London in 1851. It is a sculpture that is rich with meaning. It references the Greek War for Independence, but it also came to be a symbol for abolitionists. And it earned Powers an international reputation and made him a cultural ambassador for the United States in the 1840s, a time when many Europeans and Americans questioned if we would ever have a national culture. And I'm showing you just an image from the Archives of American Art of Hiram Powers and one of the examples of the marble versions of the Greek slave. He made 6, not all of them survive. So our goal was to create this small focus exhibition about the making of the Greek slave. And I should just give a word of acknowledgement to the USPTO, which helped fund the exhibition, and of course my colleagues at the London Conservation Center and SI Digitization Office. Without these 3 partners, this project never could have come to fruition. In a nutshell, this is just a view of the exhibition, which was open for 2 years at the museum we affectionately call SAM, and closed this summer. But in a nutshell, it was an exhibition that focused on how Powers used traditional methods of his time to create a clay design that was then captured in a plaster mold that was then used to create a plaster cast. And this plaster cast served as a template or matrix for the replication of the sculpture in multiple marble examples. And I'm just showing you the example of that plaster model, that is the plaster template. And I don't know if you can see, but there are small dots all over her torso and other parts of her body, which are actually the point marks. I'll get to those in a minute. But they're, think of them as data points for the 19th century. And the tool that Powers Studio used to make these replicas was a pointing machine, which was really a sophisticated measuring device widely used by 19th century sculptors in their studios to mechanically replicate sculptures in marble. It consists of movable, slender metal rods that attach to a stationary crossbar, which mounts to the base of either the plaster model or the block of marble being carved. And so I'm just showing you an image from the exhibition where we had a pointed plaster bust, again with those metal point marks registering points all over the plaster bust, and then a contemporary pointing machine that could be used to replicate this bust. And we worked with a contemporary sculptor, John Saunier, who showed us how the pointing machine works and in fact helped us make a video of this bust being partially carved. So these metal rods are aligned with X marks or metal pinpoints on the plaster that indicate the high and low contours of the sculpture. And the whole apparatus is moved to the block being carved, and then we register the measurements. They're transferred to corresponding locations on the marble. The instrument is moved back and forth between plaster and marble hundreds of times, guiding the carver to remove just the right amount of marble from the block. The pointing machine was a critical tool that allowed Powers to control the quality of his replicas while meeting market demands for his most popular compositions, which he offered in a variety of sizes and formats. Thus, there's the bust of the Greek slave as well as the full-scale example. And I'm showing you again what was kind of an experiment day in the London Conservation Center where you see John, that contemporary sculptor, using a pointing machine to show us how it would have been rigged on our plaster model. and then again, a pointing machine on a partially carved block of marble. So using this method, which I have to admit I've grossly condensed to be able to share it with you in these few minutes, but using this method, Powers produced in his studio 6 examples of the Greek slave. And I should underscore, for those of you who haven't seen an example, it's a life-size figure, and there is one in the National Gallery that was once part of the Corcoran collection. So we do have one in Washington. So where does this take us with digitization? Well, as part of the exhibition preparation, we had an opportunity to scan Powers' full-scale plaster model. And I've been told this was the first time that Sam had ushered forth an object from the collection for full 3D digitization. Now, my impulse, really my purpose, in submitting this work for 3D scanning was to preserve the plaster. It was remarkable that it had survived some 150 years, and I thought the 3D scan was the best way to keep it forever. So preservation, as well as documentation, and truly being able to render this one object more accessible through the digital world. But, and Vince Rossi told me this would happen, once you scan something, all sorts of things will emerge of what you might want to do with the digital file. So in the course of digitizing this sculpture, the tremendous unexpected consequences that emerged were that scanning itself became a means of examination and interpretation. Most important to me was how the scan became an indexical digital version of the plaster. And I should say it's a 3-dimensional object, so now you have this flat, turnable, if you will, measure of what you're looking at. And this index, or digital version, could be used as a powerful tool to compare and quantify differences between the plaster model and other objects. For example, we scanned the bizarre body cast, a life cast of a woman's arm, a woman who presumably served as Hiram Powers' model for at least part of the Greek slave. And I'm just showing you here the 2 plasters. And again, to give you a sense of the one-to-one relationship, which, you know, we very amateurly had started to measure with tape measures and pieces of string and trying to suggest maybe it is the same, maybe it isn't, how does it differ, where does it differ? And again, thanks to the 3D digitization, deviation analysis of the scan of the plaster sculpture and the cast of the woman's arm revealed very little difference between these 2 objects, suggesting that the sculpture may in fact have been a composition of sections of casts of living people, not even necessarily one single model, maybe a composite of his favorite models. And also, maybe not entirely sculpted by the tools that we thought. Maybe a mashup of the real and the ideal. This was something that I might have suspected, but I could not confirm until we had the scans and the digitization, the deviation analysis. The scan also had me thinking about the 6 full-scale marble carvings and how they related, one to the other, but also to the plaster model. Ideally, we could someday scan each of these marble sculptures and run a deviation analysis for each one against the plaster master. The scanning process fascinated me as I came to see the 21st century parallel to the whole replication process used by 19th century sculptors. After all, both the pointing machine and the scans are orthometric systems, measuring with precision. Just as SI's digitization office had completed the digital rendering of the model, which of course is available online to the public, we found in the reopening the museum's Renwick galleries following a major renovation that, of course, the octagon room in the Renwick had been designed by the original owner of the building, William Corcoran, to feature his marble of the Greek slave. And to help visitors imagine what this historical room looked like in the 19th century, and to remind them of its unique purpose, we printed a polymer-infused glass example of the Greek slave, which was then placed in the octagon room at the Renwick. And so I'm showing you in this last slide this contemporary 3D print from our 19th century plaster, all possible through the scanning. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm going to be presenting the Smithsonian Learning Lab, and I'm the director of the Smithsonian Center for Learning and Digital Access. And I'm really a stand-in today for Darren Milligan, who is the digital strategist in our office and the project manager for this lab. So I'll do the best I can to represent Darren. I'd like to talk a little bit, similar to Mark, about the role of research in developing this lab. For over 10 years, our office published a publication called Smithsonian in Your Classroom. It represented ways to use our collections across the curriculum, and it was sent to every elementary and middle school in the country. We had a high number of downloads, it had won awards, we had good user feedback. But we decided to go a bit deeper, and we took a random sample of users and we did follow-up interviews with them. And the first 3 questions we asked, we got the results that we wanted. But when we started to go a bit deeper into the 4th and 5th questions, we said, how did you use it? Some said, well, I couldn't really use it because it didn't work for me. Or they said, if they did use it, 95% of them said that they changed it. And if any of you have ever developed publications, you know your heart sinks because you've spent hours over every word, so you can't imagine why anyone would want to change it. But what in fact they told us is they said, well, the reading level was too difficult for my kids, so I had to rewrite it because I was working with younger children. I wanted to include local examples. I had this handout that worked with it. I wanted to make some other kinds of comparisons. So they had interesting and worthwhile reasons for changing it. So one of the things we looked at the beginning is if we're moving from analog to digital, how can we make it more flexible so teachers are able to adapt it and use it in the ways that they need to customize it for their students. So without me going into a description of the lab, what I'm going to show you is just a short 1-minute video that kind of captures what we're trying to do with the lab. And I want to credit Cody Colthorpe, who many Smithsonian people may know, who developed this animation. Do is give the teachers the tools that they need so that they can create on their own. Now, are building off the work that was done by many other people at the Smithsonian. So this would not be possible if all the museums had not digitized their collections, made their metadata available, if the digitization office had not created collections.si.edu, which aggregates this information through Eden and makes it possible to find. So what we're doing on our platform is just adding another layer where we're tailoring it to meet the very specific needs of an audience. And so I want to now just talk about who our two primary audiences are. We have two audiences. One is internal, and that's people at the Smithsonian. And in our mind, we wanted to give, in particular, Smithsonian educators tools so that they could easily make curriculum materials, so that whenever an exhibition comes up, it's easy for them to produce these and for anyone to produce it. And the second is we wanted to give teachers, educators, students the opportunities to create using our resources. So those were our two intended audiences. Now, throughout the process, we've been doing a lot of research and studying what people actually do online, and based on that, we're taking deeper dives. So what I want to do is just talk about one case study of a surprising way in which it's been used that we hadn't anticipated. We looked at 25 different case studies of how it's being used by Smithsonian users, and I'm choosing one, and in this case, it's the Office of Development. The Office of Development started creating collections or working with us to create collections that are featured in their online fundraising campaign. What they have found as a result is that they've had a 60% increase in first-time donors. They also found that 50% of the donors surveyed had never visited the Smithsonian before. And so this led to a change in their online campaign where they changed their message to the Smithsonian at your fingertips. So this is something that we had not imagined, but it's obviously of great use to the Smithsonian. The second one is an audience that we anticipated, and that was working with teachers. And so what we've been doing is doing a number of presentations with all of our education colleagues across the Smithsonian on using the Learning Lab and how the Learning Lab can be used by teachers to create content that they use with their students. Now we have thousands and thousands of people who are coming to the lab looking for individual resources or using those collections, but like many other sites, the number of people who are actual makers is usually a smaller percentage. But of the people coming to the site, we've had 15,000 collections made in less than a year, and of those 15,000 collections, 3,000 people have said, I want to publish it and share it with the world. So what I want to do now is just show you just two of those collections, two of those 15,000 collections, to show you what value they might add. This first one is done by a teacher named Amanda Risk. Amanda is a math teacher who teaches AP Math here at Georgetown Day School. I'm embarrassed to say I didn't remember, but Amanda tells me that we met at a conference in a hall and I talked about Learning Lab for a few minutes. So all the collections she's made have been followed from a brief conversation in a hall at a conference. Amanda brings to her teaching an incredible passion. Both of her parents were artists, and she has a passion for math. So years ago, she told me, she made a spreadsheet, Excel spreadsheet, where she listed out 20 ideas of how she wanted to teach math with art. And then she put it away, but she didn't implement it because she didn't have a way to do it. She's now using Learning Lab in order to make that connection with her math students to art. And this is just one of her collections. In this collection, she takes Saul DeWitt's artwork, looking at a cube. She has them first think about the artwork, using some reflection activities that come from Harvard Project Zero. Then she, case by case, goes through looking at each of these objects, asking them to look at what the edges are, what are the planes. Later, she gets into calculating the surface area. She has them draw and replicate the cube. She uses a kind of netting to look at the surface. So she starts by looking at an art object, but then she goes deeply into looking at what does that art object mean and how can she apply it to math. And at the end, she ends with a video from Smithsonian Enterprises. And in that video, what she does is she has the students think about how do we create 3D experiences in a 2D video. So she has an extension to her next activity. The second and last example I want to give is from a student who is here in Washington, D.C. And this student was interested in the untold stories. She's a math student. She's committed to math, and she's now, in fact, in college in math. But Jade wanted to tell the stories of women in math. So she worked with the collections to go back and tell the story of Jane Hamilton, who was an early software engineer who worked on helping to put a man on the moon. And this is a wonderful story that comes out of Air and Space, but she's actually able to bring it to the surface. Now, I tell these two stories because one is in development, something we didn't anticipate, and the other is using our collections to teach math. That's something our office has not done, probably never would have done, but it shows a whole new use of the resources that we never would have imagined. We spent 2 years studying how to use Learning Lab and how people are using it, and that study will be available in January of this year, and it will have a deep insights into the kinds of collections that people are making and how they're using them. And please let me know if you'd like to get a copy of that study, and when it comes out, I'd be happy to send you the link. Thank you. And now, Matilda.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Matilda McQuaid. I'm a curator of textiles, but I happen to be the project manager on a huge digitization project we had at the Cooper Hewitt, which started in late 2014. And all this was right before we reopened. We were closed for 2 or 3 years, and which gave us the opportunity to rethink what a design museum of the 21st century is all about. And of course, very much a part of that was this digitization, this mass digitization project that we took part in. And I have to commend the DPO office, and especially Ken Rame, who was very much a part of it from day one, and also Picture A, who was our digitization provider. So thank you very much. But what's amazing about this project is that we were the first Smithsonian institution that really digitized an entire collection. And that, as I said, began in late 2014 and took about 18 months, believe it or not. And we digitized in that span of time over 180,000 objects. And it's not, and I don't mean to dismiss the Natural History Museum or any of the other collections which were just straight 2D objects, but we are talking about everything as small as a button to as large as a desk, and everything in between. We have 4 curatorial departments: textiles, wall coverings, product design and decorative arts, and then drawings, prints, and graphic design. So we ran the gamut. And of course, as curators, we always like to make headlines, so the Mass Digitization Project did do that in these various publications. And this gives you a sense of the kinds of objects that we digitized, and you can read the totals up there. But we started off with 68,000, a little over 68,000 records before the project, and then ended up with well over 200,000. So please visit our website to go through it. And so I'm just going to walk you a little bit through the project. One of the most, as I said, one of the most extraordinary parts of it was the fact that we digitized such a diverse collection, which in many ways reflects the Smithsonian's own collection. And once the digital capture took place, and this all happened within 48 hours, so from taking the object off the shelf in our Newark storage facility to digitizing it and then getting up on our collection website, that was all done within approximately 48 hours. And the object the object was captured in high-resolution capabilities so that you would have the zoom-in capabilities. So we released our collection's metadata to the public using the Creative Commons 0, a first for the Smithsonian, through GitHub and allow the digital community to play with these assets. And we are continuing to share the API with other institutions, which is, we want to increase that in the near future as we collaborate on many different types of projects and try to link our collections to other institutions. In fact, I was just talking with Ken yesterday about DPO joining the IIIF, which was kind of new to me, but which will help to facilitate this process so that we will be really part of a larger, much larger virtual collection, and then in a sense, our collection will be virtually growing in terms of other art and design collections around the world. So when we launched a public API, we had two main goals. One was to give our data away to developers, researchers, artists, so that they can use this creative raw material in new ways. And second, to build a system to support the technology in the galleries and on our website. We really wanted to see what could be done, and that is an ongoing project that we are still doing as our digital team grows, which is, we are short on staff at this point, but we hope in the next several months to kind of get that back in place. So the collection's website is all about discovering design through self-directed exploration. So navigation is designed for easy and engaging surfing of the site. Each click of the mouse takes you deeper into the collection and invites wider inquiry. So about 2 million people have visited our collection website just in the past year, which is exponentially greater than even the first year. And the most popular way of searching our collection is through color, as in this example, resulting in unexpected groupings of objects that you might not come across in a more traditional search. So there are over 118 different colors that you can search, which are a result from Crayola's color search platform. So what I've talked about so far has been sort of outside the museum walls, and I want to just briefly touch on some of the technology that has happened within the museum walls, which has also been a result of the digitization effort. And this is, some you may know about this, our new sort of Cooper Hewitt pen technology, which really is a very signature experience and was funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies. And it is a way of looking at our collection almost serendipitously, although you can collect everything in the museum. So everything in the museum on the label has a kind of crosshairs icon, and then the eraser end of the pen has a similar icon, and you press that end of the pen onto the label, and then you've automatically collect that object, which you can then refer to after you go home and log in on the computer. And the pointy end of the pen is used for playing designer on some of our digital tables, which you will see in just a second. So here you see someone actually collecting probably the intro text to an exhibition, but in a similar way you can collect high-res images for each object. So each visitor is given a pen when they come into the museum, and that pen is linked to a unique code that appears on this ticket stub. So I think that the change in mental attitude is we tell people don't throw away your ticket stub. So once the visitor has collected her object, she can review them at home by logging on to the cooperhewitt.org website and entering her unique code. And then this visitor has the ability to build a forever diary of their visit. If you actually create an account, you can do it all anonymously, but if you create an account, you can keep track of all subsequent visits. And one of our most popular rooms inside the museum is the wallpaper immersion room, which showcases several hundred examples of our wallpapers, but most importantly, allows the visitor to create her own wall covering and show it live on the wall. So the success of something as simple as drawing on the walls, or drawing on the digital table in this sense, has been popular on many different social channels, but most importantly for us, it reintroduces traditional design media such as wall coverings, to a new digi-savvy audience who really want to customize and interact with design. And your design can be saved to your pen so that you can later print it out when you get home. So this wallpaper immersion room appeared at the London Design Biennale last year at the Somerset House. And here you can see that digital table I was referring to, where she's actually designing her wallpaper on the digital table, and then it's projected live on the wall. So it's a really big step to become a global hub of design, and that is one of our major goals, is to become the design resource by working with other institutions, linking with other institutions, collections, and websites to become a larger design resource. But it's absolutely essential, and it also supports the Smithsonian's goals to have a global reach. And as with any technological innovation, we are already looking at the next iteration of both our website and pen to better serve all of our educational initiatives, both within the Cooper Hewitt and also within the Smithsonian, such as the Learning Lab, which Stephanie just talked about. And our educators are really becoming more aware of how important our collections are in the public-facing part of our institution. So that is it for my talk. I want to welcome all the panelists back, and we will have a discussion. Thank you.
So thanks to our panelists and interesting conversations about their projects. And I want to start off with just a couple of questions, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Karen, you talked a little bit about the possibilities once you had the digitization. And then Stephanie, you talked about the questions and the deep learning that you got when you talked to the focus groups. And then Matilda talked about the groupings that people found when they were searching. And the question I have for the first question is, was there an aha moment for you when you were developing the projects that you did? Something that you didn't expect, something that maybe changed course for you in your project? So, Matilda, you want to start?
Sure. I can speak for all the curators at Cooper Hewitt. I think it was, I think there was certainly the public aspect, but personally, it was rediscovering our collection. I mean, to finally have 200,000 objects, images available to you at your fingertips was pretty unbelievable. And I think it was discovery and rediscovery. So I think for me, that was the most seismic moment, was just, being able to see that almost in one fell swoop, and I think for everyone else too.
Stephanie?
I think for us, we've had lots of discussions in our office and also with educators across the institution about what it means to create. I think we imagined at first that everyone would come and know exactly how to use this and make wonderful things like Amanda did, and it's a more complicated story than that. And now we think of it more as, I think all of the people are creative, but they play different roles. And I compare it to, you have composers that may compose a symphony, and that's a special set of skills. And it would be comparable to building a collection using our resources. And then you have musicians who interpret that composition and add their own voice to it. They shift it. They may use different instruments. And that's how I think most teachers are using it. They want to be able to give their voice to it, but they may not have the skills or the time to do the actual creation.
I think that the greatest aha moment when I realized that I wanted to design a one-stop searching mechanism for my museum through our database. We have a very varied collection, and that it was going to be a lot more challenging, and that we would have to really work on creating new kinds of cataloging standards in order to be able to do that. I can give you one quick example. When I first got there, we had a registrar working with the collection, and we had certain guidelines for putting in information. And one was about whether or not a person deserved a constituent record, that is, a record that talks about the biography of the person and would be mixed and matched with other records in the database. And the guidelines said that we couldn't include a person unless we had a birth date and a death date in an official record. Well, for our museum, that leaves out a very large number of important people, people who are enslaved, under-recognized, marginalized populations. So we needed to come up with ways to manage that would still allow our material to be shareable with other institutions, including sister institutions in the Smithsonian, and we hope later with other art, history, and archival collections around the country.
Karen?
The image that I showed you, the deviation analysis, was definitely our aha moment. We had been in storage with other sculpture specialists, other curators, and the idea that you could quantify that these two objects really are related, and by this much they're the same, and by this much they're different. People may not realize that while you have all this replication going on in the 19th century, the whole idea of what's original, what's a replica, very, very different relationship, very different philosophy. You might have replicas, and that is a sign of an artist's popularity, a sign of success. But what is original? Well, under no circumstances would you expect the sculptor to be doing a body cast instead of modeling. And in fact, people like Rodin were, that was the worst thing you could say of a sculptor is, you body cast that, you didn't sculpt it. So I just sort of fill this in as part of a history that when you do have this deviation analysis, and you can say, he really did use body casting, fundamental to making the Greek slave, even if we're not sure yet how. For me, it was a true aha moment.
Thanks. All right, we'll take questions from the audience. Any questions? Well, let me ask one more question to the group, and I think a number of you touched on this. Once we get started down that path of digitization, one of the things that I think we all ask ourselves is, how do we balance the audience needs with our staffing, with our time, and with our resources? And I know, Matilda, you talked about having some positions that you need to fill, and you've had the pen and other things. How do you manage that next step for the audience?
Well, I think, right now we're sort of in the planning stages of the next iteration. I think that, we want to update our collections website. We want to kind of come up with a new technology. But I think we've only been open 2 years, so I think we're still sort of, I think our numbers are only increasing in terms of visits, and that's right now the only way we can kind of quantify. We haven't gone into a deep evaluation of the website in terms of users and how that's ultimately impacting them. But I think we're waiting until kind of our next sort of digital leader is hired to kind of see where we're really going to go. But I just wanted to also mention one more aha moment, because it touches on what Laura said in terms of I think as a curator, I kind of went into it, I think as a lot of curators do, very tentatively about digitization. And I think the aha moment for me was it changed my attitude about digitization very much. And I can say that across the board at the Cooper Hewitt, that if anything, I think we're trying to reveal, because in a way, it's kind of like crowdsourcing, asking the public to kind of fill in some of the information that we don't have, because we as curators didn't want to release anything until it was perfect, but imperfect is now the way to go. And so it's, because the public out there knows a lot, and so I think, relying on their input is also really helpful. So sorry to go back, but just wanted to say that.
No, thanks, Matilda. And I want to thank my colleagues here for speaking today to the group. And this concludes this session. Okay, go ahead. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
I'm interested in the process of curating the process of digitizing, in the sense of, as we're doing this, we have an entire generation of people now who have lived where they're, in a world where things are digitized, and one of the things that seems to be a problem is that if it's not digitized, it doesn't exist. And is it our responsibility to talk about the process of digitization and how what is digitized is not a complete model of what's out there?
Who wants to tackle that? Stephanie?
To say something about this, because it's really interesting. When we work with students, they don't see a difference between Smithsonian website and Google. It's all information to them, and they're not differentiating where the sources are. We also find that you can upload in Learning Lab, and people were uploading without putting appropriate citations. So for me, there is a management responsibility. All of the collections that are published are reviewed. We have to have someone look at them to make sure that they meet the guidelines of the Smithsonian. We interact with our people when they publish to say, you might think about this. So there, even once something's published, there's an ongoing curation of helping people to be good digital citizens by citing their sources, by thinking about what is a reliable source. So there's a real opportunity to develop that knowledge too, I think.
Anyone else? Laura?
I can answer that too. For our museum, the first round of digitization, what we were going to digitize was pretty obvious because we wanted to try to reach, to have records and images of as many things that were on view in the museum as possible, along with the director's top 10 favorite things and the curator's top 10 favorite things from their exhibitions and from the collection. We also needed to have a lot of publication photographs and photographs for publicity. Now that we're moving into our being open phase, it's a lot less obvious where we should go next. And we're trying different methods of surveying curators and others in the museum to find out what they want to make available next and how to make that available. We'd also like to be able to know what our users are, to differentiate, to know who the learners and the curious are and how they're using the assets, which might give us clues to what we should do next.
All right, thank you.